There's a moment early in this book that really caught my attention. Lippmann is describing the outbreak of World War I, and he writes, there was a moment when the picture of Europe on which men were conducting their business as usual did not in any way correspond to the Europe which is about to make a jumble of their lives. There was a time for each man when he was still adjusted to an environment that no longer existed. Read that again. Adjusted to an environment that no longer existed. People were making plans, buying goods they'd never be able to import, starting careers, writing books describing a world that had already ended, and they just didn't know it yet. And then he gives you the other end of the war. November 1918, the armistice is announced. People pour into the streets. The war is over. Relief, celebration. Except the armistice hadn't actually happened yet. In the 5 days before the real armistice came, though the end of the war had been celebrated, several thousand young men died on the battlefields. Several thousand men dead in a gap between the picture in people's heads and the reality on the ground. That gap between what people believe is happening and what is actually happening, that's what the entire book is about. And if you work in public affairs, that gap is where you live. It's where I live. It's where we all live. I'm Joseph Lavoie, and this is Masters in Public Affairs, where we go back to the foundational books in the field and extract the principles that made the best practitioners return again and again. Today, we're covering what might be the most important book ever written about how public opinion actually works. Not how we wish it would work, not how maybe civics textbooks teach political science. This is how public opinion actually works. The book is Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann, published in 1922. Now, 1922, that's over a century ago. That's before television, it's before the internet, it's before social media, TikTok. And you might wonder why we're going back that far. Well, here's why. Lippmann saw something in 1922 that most people, I think, struggle to understand today. And I say most people, I include myself in this. It's why we're going back to the fundamentals and we're reading some of these books. He saw the mechanism. He saw how public opinion forms, and that mechanism hasn't changed. The technology has, absolutely. The speed has changed. The scale absolutely is entirely different today as it was than it was in 1922. But the fundamental process that Lippmann describes, it's the same now as it was then in 1922. This is a long episode. I'm not going to apologize for that. There's too much here that matters. And if you work in public affairs, government relations, communications, advocacy, stakeholder engagement, this book will change how you see your work. And it certainly, I can say, it has changed the way I think about my work. So let's get into it. The reason why we're doing Masters in Public Affairs the way we are by spending time with these books is that every book is a response to a problem, usually a problem that the author experienced directly. And Walter Lippmann was considered one of the most influential journalists and political commentators of the 20th century. He advised presidents, he helped shape American foreign policy, and he was, by many measures, considered an insider. And so he watched the machinery of democracy up close during World War I. He had seen how government shaped public opinion during wartime, particularly as it comes to the production of propaganda, management around censorship, the deliberate construction of narratives. And he'd seen how the public responded to events that couldn't directly be observed. And he'd seen the consequences when those responses were based on pictures that didn't match reality. Pictures. We're going to come back to this. It's a theme that comes up a lot in this book. So the problem that Lippmann was trying to solve is this. Democratic theory assumes that citizens form opinions based on facts and that those opinions guide policy. But what happens when citizens can't access those facts? What happens when the world is way too big, too complex, too fast for any individual to directly experience? This wasn't an abstract question for Lippmann. He was watching it play out in real time. Listen to how he describes what he observed. Looking back, we can see how indirectly we know the environment in which we nevertheless live. We can see that the news of it comes to us now fast, now slowly, but that whatever we believe to be a true picture, we treat as if it were the environment itself. That's the problem. We treat our picture of reality as if it were reality. We can't help it. We have no choice. We can't directly experience most of what we have opinions about. So here's the kicker, I think. The thing that I think makes Lippmann permanently relevant today is this quote. It is harder to remember that about the beliefs upon which we are now acting. So we can look back at past eras and see where people were deluded. We can see where the medieval church had a distorted picture of the cosmos. We can see where 19th century imperialists had distorted pictures of the peoples that they colonized. That's easy, very easy to apply hindsight. What's hard, what's almost impossible, is seeing where our current beliefs are based on pictures that don't match reality. We're always inside the picture and we can never fully step outside of it. So Lippmann isn't writing this as a critic. He's not throwing stones inside his glass house. He is writing it as someone who participated in constructing those pictures. He helped write propaganda during the war. He knows how the sausage is made. And that knowledge is what makes this book so uncomfortable in some ways, but also incredibly valuable. If I had to reduce the entire book into one sentence, it would be this. People don't respond to reality. They respond to pictures of reality in their heads. Okay, I cheated 2 sentences, not one. That's it. That's the whole thing. Let me repeat that again. People don't respond to reality. They respond to pictures of reality in their heads. Let me show you how Lippmann builds this out because the implications for us in our line of work are enormous. He writes, the only feeling that anyone can have about an event he does not experience is the feeling aroused by his mental image of that event. That is why until we know what others think they know, we cannot truly understand their acts. Read that last part again. Until we know what others think they know, we cannot truly understand their acts. This completely reframes how you think about public opinion. You can't understand why people support or oppose something by looking at the facts of the situation. You have to look at the picture of the situation that exists in their heads. And those are two very different things. And here's what makes this genuinely unsettling. He writes, for it is clear enough that under certain conditions, men respond as powerfully to fictions as they do realities, and that in many cases, they help to create the very fictions to which they respond. So people respond as powerfully to fictions as to realities. And we're going to explore this even more in the next book in our program. And we get to how we can change minds. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but we're going to come back to this theme a couple times in the coming weeks. People respond as powerfully to fictions as to realities, and they help create those fictions they respond to. This is, when you think about it, it's not the most comfortable idea for us. It's not how we like to think of ourselves either. We like to think we're very rational. We assess the information, we assess the facts that we have, we weigh the evidence, and we form considered judgments. Lippmann is saying, no, you respond to pictures, and you don't even know where most of those pictures come from. Now, Lippmann has a specific term for these pictures. He calls them the pseudo-environment. The pseudo-environment is the mental representation of the world that we act upon. It's constructed from incomplete information filtered through pre-existing beliefs, shaped by symbols and narratives and intermediaries. And here's the crucial point. Behavior happens in the real environment, but it's stimulated by the pseudo environment. So you have the situation where people make decisions based on a picture that may or may not match reality. And then those decisions have consequences in the real world, whether the picture was accurate or not. So think about that armistice example again. People celebrated because their pseudo environment contained the belief that the war was over. Their celebration was real, their relief was real, but the war wasn't over yet. And in the gap between the picture and the reality, men kept dying because the war wasn't over. And this is why Lippmann matters for public affairs, why it matters for our industry. The gap between pseudo environment and reality is not a curiosity. It is where often the consequences of our work live. And often it's that gap that we're trying to close and fix with a lot of the work that we do. Okay, so people respond to pictures. They don't respond to reality. The next question is, where do these pictures come from? And Lippmann's answer is that they're constructed. They're built by intermediaries. Let me walk you through the mechanism because this is the operational part of the book and the part that actually tells you how public opinion forms. So step one, reality is inaccessible. Most of what we have opinions about, we have never directly experienced. You have opinions about foreign policy, about economic conditions, about industries you've never worked in, about places you've never been to, because you have to. Modern citizenship requires it, but you don't have direct access to those things. You can't observe from yourself. You rely on reports, on information that comes to you from somewhere else. Step two, information is filtered. The information that reaches you has already been selected, shaped, and framed. Lippmann talks at length about the press, but the principle applies more broadly. Someone decided what to report, someone decided how to describe it, someone decided what context to include or to exclude. And this isn't necessarily malicious, it's structural. That's more happening in the world than anyone can report because selection is inevitable. But selection also shapes the picture. Okay, step three, the picture is animated by stereotypes. This is one of Lippmann's most important contributions, I think. He's actually the one who introduced the word stereotype into social science in its modern sense. A stereotype for him is not just a prejudice, it's a mental shortcut. It's a pre-existing category that we use to make sense of new information. And when information comes to us, we don't process it from scratch. We fit it into these categories that we already have. Those categories tell us what the information means, how to deal with it, how to feel about it, and what to do with it. He writes, what will be accepted as true, as realistic, as good, as evil, as desirable, is not eternally fixed. These are fixed by stereotypes from earlier experiences and carried over into judgment of later ones. So the picture in your head is not just a passive recording of information. It's an active construction shaped by those mental frameworks that you acquired long before you encountered the specific situation you're now trying to understand. Step four, identification makes it personal. So Lippmann observes that a picture doesn't become meaningful to us until we can locate ourselves in it somehow. He writes, no visual idea is significant to us until it has enveloped some stress of our own personality, until it releases or resists, depresses or enhances some craving of our own, it remains one of the objects which do not matter. So you have to be able to identify with something in the story. You have to find what Lippmann calls a familiar foothold. This is why public affairs issues get framed in terms of heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators. It's why abstract policy debates get personalized, because people cannot engage with pure abstraction. They need a way in. He also writes, just as everyone holds his breath when the heroine is in danger, as he helps Babe Ruth swing his bat, so in subtler form the reader enters into the news. In order that he shall enter, he must find a familiar foothold in the story, and this is supplied to him by the use of stereotypes. So stereotypes aren't just simplifications, they're entry points. They're how people get a grip on information that would otherwise remain distant and abstract. Let me give you Lippmann's own summary of this mechanism because I think it's worth hearing it directly. He makes a distinction between news and truth. I found this really interesting, so it's crucial. He writes, the hypothesis, which seems to be the most fertile, is that news and truth are not the same thing and must be clearly distinguished. The function of news is to signalize an event. The function of truth is to bring to light the hidden facts, to set them into relation with each other and make a picture of reality on which men can act. News signals, truth reveals. Or put another way, news tells you something happened, truth tells you what it means. And these are different functions, and Lippmann argues that we've confused them. We expect news to deliver truth, but news structurally can only deliver signals. Okay, let me pull out 3 mental models from this book that I think are permanently useful. Model number 1, the pseudo environment. I touched on this earlier. I'm going to come back to it because I think it's very important. And it's going to be a theme that we're going to come back to actually in our next book. This is ultimately his core framework. Every person operates within a mental model of the world that is not identical to the world itself. This pseudo-environment is constructed from available information, shaped by stereotypes, and animated by identification. The practical implication is this: if you want to understand why people hold opinions they hold, you have to reconstruct their pseudo-environment. What information do they have access to? What categories are they using to interpret that information? Where have they located themselves in the story? And you cannot understand public opinion by looking at the facts of the situation. You have to look at the pictures of the situation that exist in people's heads and think about how really difficult that is. The picture that I have is going to be so different than the picture that you have. And you think about compounding that over the entire population base. It is such a complex thing that we're trying to do when we are trying to understand the pseudo environment that people are operating in. Okay, mental model number 2 is the stylization requirement. So raw reality doesn't become public until it's stylized. Lippmann gives a vivid example. He talks about how bad conditions in a factory don't become news just by existing. They become news when there's signals, when there's a strike, or when the Board of Health issues a report, or when something forces the conditions into a form that can be transmitted. He says the bad conditions, as such, are not news because, in all but exceptional cases, journalism is not a first report of raw material. It's a report of that material after it has been stylized. So this is true far beyond journalism, right? In policy, in advocacy, in stakeholder relations, issues don't become issues until they're stylized into a form that can be perceived and communicated. And I don't think that's manipulation. It's just the structure of how information works. We can resent it, or we can just simply understand it. And Lippmann argues that we should just choose to understand it. Okay, mental model number 3 is the interested intermediary. Again, something we talked about briefly earlier. Someone shapes the picture. Someone always shapes the picture. Lippmann is clear-eyed about this. He describes the rise of what he calls the press agent, what we, of course, today would call communications professionals, public relations, public affairs, the entire field. And he says in the book, he writes, the development of the publicity man is a clear sign that the facts of modern life do not spontaneously take shape in which they can be known. They must be given a shape by somebody. This is the origin point for our entire profession. Facts don't shape themselves. Someone has to do the shaping. And if you don't do it, guess what? Someone else will. Lippmann doesn't moralize about this. He just observes it. Organized group eventually figures out that the picture of them that reaches the public is too important to leave to chance. So they hire people to participate in the shaping. And thank God, it means many of us have careers as a result of it. Okay, now there's a way to misread Lippmann that makes him dangerous. Let me address these directly. So the first misreading would be that he's pretty cynical about democracy. And this is wrong. Lippmann is diagnostic. He's about democracy. He's describing how opinion actually forms, and he's not celebrating or condemning it. Yes, he's saying that public opinion is often based on incomplete information. It's shaped by intermediaries, filtered through stereotypes. But he's not saying this means democracy is a sham or that the public should be manipulated. He's saying this is how it works. Now, what are we going to do about it? And so, in fact, Lippmann spends a significant portion of the book proposing reforms, better intelligence systems, expert bureaus, improvements in how information reaches the public. Many of these ideas are definitely baked for an era of the author's time. And so they seem a little bit quaint in 2026, but I'm sure in 1922, these were some pretty avant-garde ideas. He's trying to make the picture more accurate. He's not arguing that accuracy is impossible. So he is coming at it from, I think, from a good perspective and with the right intent. Okay, second misreading is that this book creates the conditions or teaches us how to, and it gives us, as a result, a license to manipulate. And if people respond to pictures rather than reality, does that mean that the job of public affairs is to construct favorable pictures regardless of the underlying reality? No, and Lippmann would say no as well. Understanding how public opinion forms does not license us to exploit that process. It raises the stakes for responsibility, absolutely. If you know that people will respond to pictures and you know that you're participating in shaping those pictures, then you have I would argue, a greater responsibility to ensure that the pictures you create are accurate, not less. And so the choice is between manipulation and ignorance. The choice is between shaping pictures consciously and responsibly, or doing it unconsciously and carelessly. And then I think another way to misread the book would be to assume that he's arguing that the public is stupid and not well briefed on these things. Lippmann is sometimes read as an elitist, looking down on the masses who can't see reality clearly. But if you look at what he says everyone operates in a pseudo environment. The elite too, the experts too, the insiders too. We all operate in a pseudo environment. I'm quoting from the book here. He wrote, "Great men, even during their lifetime, are usually known to the public only through a fictitious personality. Hence the modicum of truth in the old saying that no man is a hero to his valet. There is only a modicum of truth, for the valet and the private secretary are often immersed in the fictions themselves." Everyone's operating on incomplete pictures. The president has incomplete pictures. The CEO has incomplete pictures. The expert has incomplete pictures. You do, I do. We all have incomplete pictures. So the question isn't who has perfect access to reality, since we're going to agree, at least if we believe Lippmann, that no one does. The question is how we construct institutions that help the pictures become more accurate over time. And you do get a sense in the book that this was a bit of a cause that Lippmann was pursuing. All right, so it's a book written in 1922. We are well over a century since this book was written. How can we start to think about it in a modern application? And I think that everything Lippmann describes, frankly, has intensified. It's much more intense than how he describes it. He was writing about newspapers, and we live in an environment that would have been unimaginable to him. 24-hour news cycles. I mean, do we still call them 24-hour news cycle? I feel like we are operating in 15-minute news cycles. Think about social media, algorithmic curation, personalized information feeds, the degree to which people have become even more polarized in the modern context. It's a totally different operating environment that we're in, right? But the basic mechanism, I think, is the same. People respond to pictures, not reality. But the picture making machinery has become obviously far more powerful, faster in its production, and way more fragmented, right? So let me walk you through some implications as I see them. The first is that the pseudo environment is now personalized. In Lippmann's day, most people in a given city were reading similar newspapers. Now, he does talk about the huge volume of newspapers available across America and specific communities. And into today's ear, it's shocking to hear how many different newspapers existed, because we know what's happened to the media landscape in the last couple decades. But ultimately, people were largely reading from or digesting somewhat similar pictures. You could speak of public opinion as if it were singular. Now, that wouldn't necessarily be accurate, but certainly probably a bit more accurate than it is today. So everyone's curating their own information environment. Everyone's operating in a slightly different pseudo environment. The pictures are fragmenting, and this has massive implications for public affairs. You're no longer trying to understand a pseudo environment. You're trying to understand, well, more than dozens. I think if we're prepared to say that every single individual you're trying to reach has their own pseudo environment, then I can't even imagine the number of pseudo environments that you're tasked with engaging with as part of your work. And each of those pseudo environments comes with their own information sources, their own stereotypes, their own ways of making sense of events. And I think about the challenge that we have, and it's very overwhelming. I think way more challenging today than it ever has been. Okay, how else can we apply what we learned from Lippmann in the modern day? How else can we apply what we learned from Lippmann in a modern context? I think stylization happens faster. Lippmann talked about how conditions become news when they're signaled, right? That passage we read earlier about the strike or a report or an overt action. Now, the stylization happens almost instantaneously. A video goes viral, a tweet gets picked up, a hashtag starts trending, the gap between a raw event and the stylized story has almost collapsed. It's pretty close to collapsing. And so that means that the window for shaping the initial picture is much smaller, and first impressions pretty much lock in much faster. And as a result, stereotypes get activated much more quickly. Okay, here's another big way that our modern environment is different than the one Walter Lippmann described. And that's, of course, that the intermediaries have multiplied. He described a world in which the key intermediaries were newspapers, government officials, and pretty much a relatively small number of opinion leaders. Of course, we know what that looks like today. Everyone with a social media account is potentially an intermediary. Anyone can participate in shaping the picture. This is sometimes called the democratization of media, but Lippmann would immediately see the flip side to this, which is that it's also the multiplication of interested parties trying to shape what you see. Let me give you a specific pattern that shows up constantly in modern public affairs and that Lippmann explains perfectly. So you're working on an issue. You have the facts. You've done the analysis. You know the policy is sound. You communicate it clearly. You expect reasonable people to be persuaded, and then they're not. Not only are they not persuaded, they're actively hostile sometimes. They seem to be responding to a completely different issue than the one you're trying to address. So what happened when you experience that reality? I think we've all experienced this in our line of work. Lippmann would say that they're not responding to your issue. They're responding to their picture of your issue. And their picture was shaped before you ever opened your mouth, before you ever presented your case, before you ever launched your campaign. They have pre-existing stereotypes. They've already identified with one side. They've already located the heroes and the villains. And when you show up with your facts, those facts get interpreted through a frame that was already in place. That is why just explain it better is so often a failed strategy. It's why I have long written about the fact that facts just don't matter. You cannot persuade with the most correct information. Because you're not fighting ignorance. What you're fighting is a pre-existing picture that makes your explanation mean something different than you ultimately intended to. And Lippmann gives us the diagnostic tool. Before you can communicate effectively, you have to understand the pseudo environment you're communicating into. Okay, so what does this book teach us about becoming excellent at public affairs? Here's what I take from it, and I definitely want to hear from you when you read this book. Shoot some notes in the comments, whether you're on Spotify or on YouTube. I want to hear what else you picked up, because I'm here to learn with you as well. I'm here to work these fundamentals together, and I'm just sharing with you today what I've taken from this book, at least as I'm reading it for the second time. And I bet you in a couple of years, when I read this for a third or fourth time, I'll have a totally different interpretation or a couple other nuggets I missed, and maybe we'll come back and do a second episode. But let's zoom out. What does this book teach us about becoming excellent at public affairs? I picked up 4 core things I'm going to walk you through. The first is that mastery means diagnosis before action. So the amateur sees a public opinion problem and immediately starts thinking about what to say. What's the message? What's the narrative? How do we communicate? Now, I know most of us who have been in this business a long time know that you don't go straight there, because that's a fool's game. The master asks different questions first. What pictures exist in the heads of the people we need to reach? Now, I think that's why we do a lot of public opinion research these days. Where did those pictures come from? What stereotypes are they using to interpret information? Where have they located themselves in the story? And this is why I fundamentally have a strong bias towards doing a lot of qualitative research when trying to diagnose a public policy issue or trying to prepare for a campaign, because the question of those whys, is surfacing those stereotypes, is very difficult to get at a broad level from a quantitative basis. And the reason why I care so much about getting a sense of those and, recognizing all the limitations that we talked about earlier, you're never going to get a complete picture. But after you've at least started to get clarity on the pseudo environment, you can start to think intelligently about how to communicate into it. And in a couple of books from now, we're going to talk about this a little bit more. We're going to talk about, we're going to review, we're going to explore Frank Luntz's book on words that work, what to say, what not to say, frames. So we're going to come back to how frames impact the pseudo environment on a later episode. But once we understand what that pseudo environment is, we're better equipped to communicate into it. Okay, here's the other thing big takeaway I have from this book, and that is that mastery means humility about your own pictures. He's clear in this book. Everyone operates in a pseudo environment. He does. I do. You do. Every single person we're interacting with on a daily basis does. And so in our line of work, the master public affairs practitioner knows that their own picture of reality is incomplete. They're suspicious of their own certainties. They're actively looking for ways their picture might be wrong. And that isn't a weakness, right? I mean, I constantly make forecasts, predictions about what's going to occur either politically or in a regulatory context, and I get them wrong. Why do I get them wrong? Well, first, and this is another topic we'll get to at a later date, political forecasting is notoriously difficult. and inaccurate. But the other one is I probably have a series of pictures in my head that I haven't quite deconstructed. I haven't wrapped my head around. And so I'm seeing the facts of the case in a very precise way, my own precise way. And that, it can be seen as a weakness, but I think being aware and attuned to this can actually help you become much more precise in your work, because you cannot navigate the gap between picture and reality if you don't acknowledge that you are subject to that same gap. Okay, another big takeaway for me, mastery means taking responsibility for the pictures you create. If you understand how opinion forms, if you see the mechanism, you cannot pretend innocence when you participate in shaping pictures. Every communication you put out is contributing to someone else's pseudo environment. Every frame you use, every story you tell, every fact you emphasize or omit, these are shaping the picture in people's heads. The master takes responsibility for this, not in a way that paralyzes, but certainly in a way that raises a standard. If I'm going to shape pictures, I'm going to do it in a way that makes the pictures more accurate, not less. And then the last thing I got out of the book is this, that mastery means respecting the limits. Lippmann never pretended that the press or any institution could solve this problem completely. The gap between picture and reality is permanent. It's structural, and it's not going away. So we have to accept this. We don't expect public opinion to be a perfect reflection of reality. We know and work within the limits of what's possible. Accepting these limits is not the same as accepting failure, though, right? You can acknowledge that pictures will always be incomplete while still working to make them less incomplete. And you can accept that stereotypes are unavoidable while still working to ensure the stereotypes in play are fair and accurate. So we just got to acknowledge the limitations that we're dealing with. It doesn't mean we need to give up. It doesn't mean that we need to be crass about it, but being aware, I think, is important to how we design our work, our approach to engaging the public. Here's a sentence I keep coming back to in the book. It's as follows. The only feeling that anyone can have about an event he does not experience is the feeling aroused by his mental image of that event. This is a fundamental insight of this book. This is what Lippmann saw. People respond to pictures, not reality to pictures. And if you work in public affairs, you're in the business of pictures, whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not. So the question then becomes whether you'll do that work consciously or unconsciously, whether you'll understand the mechanism or stumble around it, whether you'll take responsibility for the pictures that you create or pretend you're just presenting the facts. I'd say let's stop pretending that we are presenting the facts. Lippmann wrote this book, as I said earlier, over 100 years ago, and the technology has absolutely changed beyond recognition from 1922, but the mechanism is the same. The gap between picture and reality is the same. So the challenge is the same. And if you want to master public affairs, you have to start by understanding what Lippmann understood, that the world we act upon is not the world as it is, it's the world as we picture it. And the gap between those two things is where your work happens. Guys, thank you so much for listening so far and all the way to the end. I'm Joseph Davois. This has been Masters in Public Affairs. Please, if you found this interesting, share it with your friends. My hope is that this entire series, this entire show can appeal to those of us who've been in the business longer than we'd like to admit, to someone who's just getting started in public affairs. So if there's someone in your network that you think would benefit from this series, please do share it. We'll be back. We'll be back to talk about how to change public opinion in our next episode. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.